Excellent. Thanks, guys, and thanks for checking in and participating. As Michael is talking, if you do have questions, please type them in. But my suggestion with Michael will be that he answers them at the end. We do have just a little bit over an hour. He has heaps of content. He may not think he has a lot of slides because for him, it's second nature. He's created them. He's pulled them together. And as a bit of a build up there, I started reading Michael Matusik's reports in early 2000, I think like 2003, actually 20 years ago when I was working for a property company, and he was talking about Stone's Corner back in the day. I remember a report there, really, really good. And I found over the last, especially 5 years, that my conclusions, whether intentionally or not, have no, I'd say 95% agreed with Michael's comments and conclusions. And the good thing I like about that is that not just because he agrees with me, but the thing I like about it is his the way he determines his conclusions are very different or statistically based than mine. I get my data from a lot of different sources, not so much statistics, but more so to talking to a lot of wealthy and successful and interactive people who are involved in the marketplace. And that's why I like looking at Matusik stuff, because we 95% of the time conclude that the same thing, but he puts the data behind it, not just I feel this or I see this or I hear that. It is data driven. So, he's going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. I've written it down. They're from my website, his website as well. He's going to be talking about, interest rates. He's going to talk about, what's happening in various cities and main states, their population, talk about obviously the housing market, supply, and rising demand. Is there going to be a correction? Maybe if we get time, we'll talk about the Olympic Games. But, if you haven't subscribed already to his newsletter, definitely subscribe to his newsletter there. I am a paying member, and I know there's a lot of free data out there, but I believe you get what you pay for. With his newsletter, when he started charging for it, you know what? I said, bang, I'm in, and I bought his reports as well. So he's going to give you opportunity to buy his reports. I've been badgering him for a long time, if not over 2 years, for him to produce his reports. And within an hour of the email, Michael, I paid, and you probably saw that through. And mate, I'm a very, very happy customer. That
Well,
data.
hence we're doing this rather than a one-on-one
Yes,
30-minute personal.
that's right. That's
People,
right. So
quickly, before I get into the content, if you just Google my name, you'll go to my website. There's a range of reports there. If you follow me on Substack, so it'll be in the first page of Googling my name. If you actually become a paid member, I think it's $300 a year plus GST. You get extra stuff every week when I write something, but you also save 20% on my reports. And so if you do that, you can buy these Outlook reports. And if you buy the box set, which has happened here, then you can actually get a 30-minute one-on-one session. Now, look, I'm going overseas for 9 weeks at the end of this week to the UK. The boss has said no work. So don't expect me to reply this side of November if you
that's
are
right.
a subscriber, but a paid subscriber, but I will get back to you. So anyway, let's keep going. Let's go, shall we?
Yep.
Okay, so
Mate.
I'm not
Go for it.
moving the slides because I'm a lazy bugger. So I'm just going to say next, and the slides will move. So we're going to talk about the housing market. We are going to take a bird's eye view, not a worm view. So we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of what's happening in Stone's Corner or Toowoomba or anything like that. We might mention some of those locations, but we're here giving a macro view. So the next slide, please. So first thing we're going to do is current state of play. Next. Okay, so real estate's simple. This is all about supply and demand. And so when demand exceeds supply, we see property prices go up and we see rents go up. So that's all it is. I mean, there's people who think it's a real science and everything else. It isn't. It's about those two things. And what we're seeing across Australia, and here we're talking about the established market, the existing market, the resale market. We're seeing overall that there's been a lift in the number of sales shown by the blue bars on the chart, and we're seeing the volume of sales, the volume of properties listed for sale, that's in the red line, slowly decline. Now that's happening because a lot of people cannot find value for money when selling, so they're not listing. and also because people like where they live. So when you look at the two, the market demand versus the supply, you'll see that the supply in months has actually declined. So on average across Australia, most properties, most houses sell within a 3-month period. And that includes apartments as well. Now, if they're poorly marketed, overpriced, then of course they take longer. And that market is quite tight. And hence you're seeing for sale signs go up quickly and you're seeing prices continue to rise, which is a strange thing given that interest rates have risen as much as they have. But we'll talk about that later on. Next slide, please. What we've seen in Australia is that values have risen very sharply. Well, have risen consistently. Here I've used 2000 because, we've just seen the Olympics. So let's pick a date being the Sydney Olympics. And we've seen detached house prices on average cost $1 million across Australia. Now, I remember arguing with somebody 5 years ago saying that I'd be damn surprised if they get to $1 million within 5 years. And I lost that bet because I said somewhere like 800, 850. And there's reasons why, and we'll get to why it's accelerated soon. You can see there's periods of time when prices don't go up and they actually decline a bit. But that's rare and it only takes place for a short period of time. Apartments and townhouses have increased not as much. That's because there's only so much land and it's hard to create that land. So something on a detached house with its own block of land increases more than, say, an apartment or townhouse. The other reason why is that because in a townhouse or particularly an apartment complex, you do have a lot of competition and not much difference between the product. So here we're talking about if you bought into an apartment building of 100, they're nearly all the same. They're very hard to make anything different. And usually 5 to 8 of those resell every year. And all it takes is 1 or 2 forced sales, and all of a sudden the price points aren't as strong as they once were. So I'm not saying you don't buy an apartment or townhouse. You probably just got to be mindful of what you're buying it for. I could argue that the rental returns on a gross basis might be better. Even a net basis might be better, but it's usually something with a touching the ground where freehold ownership's involved that shows the better growth. Next slide, please. When we come to the rental market has contracted. We know this, we read about it, we hear, certain political parties ramble on about it. Usually, well, there's been up before COVID, 80,000 vacant properties for rent across Australia. That's dropped to about half that volume. Now, not a lot of that's to do with COVID, not a lot of that's to do with people living alone and investors taking their stock off the market. This was a slow burn. What APRA did between 2014 and 19 was stop the amount or restrict the amount of investing that banks could do lending that the banks could do to investors. They stopped the book so it couldn't expand to more than 10% per annum. That slowed down the amount of investment lending, and that is one of the major reasons for the contraction in the amount of stock available for rent. It's great if you own property and you're renting it out because you've got a queue and you can charge more. And you can see as well that it's not the first time that we've seen that happen. After the 2000 Olympics and so forth, the market got tight and there was less investors as well. So this is just to do with the volume of investors in the market. At the moment, the vacancy rate's tight, and it's going to be very difficult to get it back to 2 to 3%, which is a balanced market in the future. So I believe the rents are going to continue to rise. And tenants, if they can't afford the rent, they're just going to have to share. And that's the solution moving forward in terms of getting more return for your investment property in terms of rental return, but also in terms of resale value, because increasingly people are forced to live in a multi-generational or group living. And to be honest, That's where most of the Western world lives. They don't have the luxury of living as couples or as singles. They live in a shared situation. And Australia's just facing that reality now. Next slide, please. You can see that rents have gone up, not as much as prices, if you looked at the couple of charts before on this one. And you can see that rents go up and they accelerate when actually the vacancy rate's tight. Next chart, please. Okay, so I've used this chart many times. If people have been following for some time, you're quite familiar with it, but I'll just spend a couple of seconds talking about it. It's a property clock. There's a recovery, upswing, downturn, and stagnation. Let's make this very easy. For some of us, we are very cold and it's winter, and you know, our focus might not be as sharp as it is when it's warmer. So, although there's a lot of proof to say that cold rooms are better for productivity, but anyway, recovery, replace it with spring, upswing, replace it with summer, downturn, replace it with autumn, and stagnation, replace it with winter. That feeling and that in terms of temperature and what happens in those seasons apply to the property market. When you see where a seller's market is and where a buyer's market is, of course, the opposite applies. Everybody tries to sell something when S hits the fan, and people don't buy when you know it's somewhat obvious that you know we're at the bottom of the cycle and things are going to improve. Where we sit in the cycle is all to do with that supply and demand. So as we get towards a peak in the market, we're seeing rising demand and falling supply. And as we get to a downturn and we hit the bottom of the market, we're seeing demand fall. That is the number of transactions taking place, and the amount of stock for sale or rent is actually increasing. Next slide, please. This is a position where we are for most of the major urban centres and capital cities across Australia at the moment. That's as of late July, early August this year. You can see that most of the market across Australia is still in a recovery and upswing phase. I believe interest rates are going to start to decline, and even the first decline will be this year. We'll get to that soon. And so all those areas that are, say, set between Toowoomba and to Noosa are going to see, I think, an increase in value and an increase in rents over the next year to 2 year period. Those areas that are in downturn, stagnation, and at the bottom of the cycle aren't going to necessarily enjoy that movement. I don't think they're going to fall much in value, but they're probably not going to move much from where they are. Next slide, please. One of the things that I've said for some time, and the evidence has changed, so I'm changing my tune, is that the property cycle is 7 years from peak to peak or trough to trough. The first chart would suggest that it actually is getting shorter. It's on average now about 4 years between peak to peak and trough to trough. And you stop and think about it, that makes some sense in terms of how we get news. You know, it used to be that you could never do this, even long, you know, long before COVID, you couldn't do something like this. You had to go to an event, you had to listen to it. I was just listening to how Reuters actually started the news service, and actually started because they used to send their news by carrier pigeon from one city to the next. So, you know, things have changed. And so we get our news quickly, we get bank transfers straight away, we can access money, a whole range of things change. So it's not surprising that the cycle is getting tighter. And I think it'll go to 3 years within the next 5 to 10 years in terms of the cycle's length. The second chart just shows what's happened in the change in median rents, and I put this here to show that it's not the only time in recent history that rents have risen so much. And in fact, back in the mining boom period in 2005 to 2008, we saw rents increase just as fast or faster than they have it on an annual basis over the recent period of time. You can also see that there's large periods of time when landlords don't see increases in rent, or very small increases in rent. And when interest rates rise, particularly and their costs rise, and when there's an opportunity to rise rents, they do. Renters need to understand that and expect that. And without trying to be political, I wish the Green Party in Australia would actually look at a bit of history as well and understand that. Next slide, please. I'm going to have another sip of bourbon because, you know, you do that in cold climates. There are some winners, particularly in the capital cities. You're seeing Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth actually top of the pops, and for houses, Sydney as well. And that's all to do with supply and demand. So Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth are attracting a lot of population growth and particularly interstate migration. They're perceived to be, particularly Adelaide, is perceived to be affordable. Brisbane's got the jobs. It's not so much an Olympics thing, but it's got some of the jobs are created because of infrastructure charges, which are banked up because of the Olympics. And also for townhouses and apartments, you're seeing a similar type of areas improve. The other areas, particularly Melbourne, Canberra, Darwin, and Hobart, aren't oversupplied, but they've got adequate supplies, and the market force has dropped off, particularly in Hobart and Darwin, and to some degree Canberra. Next slide, please. So let's talk about population growth. Next slide, please. There's been a surge, a bounce back from COVID in terms of Australia's population growth. It's increasing at the moment by 650,000 people per annum. That's not sustainable. I don't think that's going to happen moving forward. Gets a lot of airplay, it gets a lot of hand wringing. It's not nice, I suspect, if you're in an area that's all of a sudden increased in terms of number of residents. That's true, and we don't follow up with infrastructure and housing supply. But a lot of these people, a lot of the population growth is coming from overseas. The second chart shows that. Most of that is to do with overseas students, 60-odd%. And they are going back to the education that they left because of COVID. And they're largely occupying student digs and the like, at least initially. When they meet somebody and learn that mum and dad are breathing down their neck, they'll share house and have fun. But often they when they first come, they go into something that either mum and dad's bought them in the capital city, in the inner city, or in something that is student-related digs. When you exclude students, 24% of the population growth is to do with, to Australia that is to do with net migration. And so they're people on visas, they might be family reunion, not enough of them are skilled workers. And I think that's one thing that we're going to see change regardless of political party moving forward. Next slide, please. If you looked at the last 10 years, on average, there's an increase of 370,000 new people per year. The projected increase is about 400,000 a year. So simply put, that Australia's population is going to expand by about 1 million people every 2.5 years. Most of that will locate in 4 locations: Southeast Queensland, Melbourne, the Sydney region, that's out to Newcastle, to Toowoomba and down to Wollongong, and the Perth area. That's about 80% of the growth, and that's been the case for the last two to 3 decades, and it's likely to be the case for the next 3 to 4 decades in terms of the population projections. If you look at the long-term ABS information, and it's pretty accurate, this stuff. There's not much conjecture to it, so that's likely to happen. Next slide, please. Without overseas migration, we would see our population decline. Now, for a range of reasons, that's not going to be acceptable or happen. One of them is geopolitical strength, but the other reason is to do with our economy. Economies grow because of 3 things: debt, and we could all argue, not necessarily agree, but we could all argue that we've got we could all agree, sorry, that we've got high debt. We could argue that this is sustainable. The second reason economy grows is because of productivity. Now, our productivity isn't great, and only this week a range of things were passed, labour laws and such, that makes productivity hard, particularly for private businesses to achieve. And public service, well, you know, we could argue that the public service productivity is not as what it once was. The third reason is growth. And most of that growth, whilst we can export versus our imports, be improving, but most of that growth happens because our local market increases in size, and that just simply means more bums on seats. So Australia's locked in a position where it has to expand its market to keep most of us in a satisfactory standard of living. So population growth is going to happen. Next slide, please. This just quickly shows that our fertility rate is way below replacement rate. And even with the baby bonus that costs a lot of money, I could be real cheeky and say the wrong type of people bred, and they can't now afford the electricity to pay for the big screen TV that they bought with the baby bonus. But even then, the productivity, the fertility rate did increase beyond the replacement rate. So we're going to have to see overseas migrants. And on average, the average age of an overseas migrant is 28 years of age. And so that youth coming to Australia is important for not only tax receipts, but also to do the things that many of us actually don't want to do anymore. And so we'll need those people. Next slide, please. Last slide here puts a dot on the I and a cross through the T's of what I said earlier, is that the capital cities and the immediate surrounds attract most of the growth. I think I've talked to this before to this audience in the past. I've definitely written about it, is that the talk of regional Australia becoming bigger and attracting heaps of people, particularly during that COVID period, was absolute nonsense. What happened is that people in regional Australia could not leave those cities because of COVID restrictions. Many of the young people in a regional town leave because they want to get away from mum and dad. They want to get away from the mindset of the place where they've been living. And they also want to go to brighter lights, and that might be the capital city, Sydney, Melbourne, Southeast Queensland. It also means going overseas. Keep in mind that a million of Australians are overseas. Probably 2/3 of them are escaping HECS. So when they move, the young people will move. That's something that regional towns have to address if they're going to actually prosper anything like we've seen the capital cities do. And many of them don't do it. They don't offer what a capital city does. And that's simply things like internet connection, like-minded businesses, things that young people want to engage in, bars, restaurants, eating out, connectivity, which they don't do. And it's very hard for them to do. I'm not down on a regional town. I live in a place with only 700 residents. We like it, but look at my face, look at the greyness on it. We suit this place. There's not many young people in town. And that's a challenge. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about some reasons behind the price growth that we've seen and the rental growth. Obviously, supply and demand is an issue, and we'll get to that. But there's other things that a lot of people don't necessarily equate to why we're consistently seeing price growth in Australia. Next slide, please. The first is that we attract a large proportion of the millionaires who migrate every year. There's a forecast, pretty reliable one, I've been tracking this for some time, that 135,000 millionaires will move somewhere in Australia, across the world over the next 12-month period. Now, to make this club, you have to have $1 million US, and you have to be able to invest it straight away. So it's not like, I've got it in equity or something like that. And so that's a large number, and it's an increasing number from the COVID, after the period of COVID. Next slide, please. And you can see that Australia is up until 2023 is top of the pops. And during that financial year, you saw 5,200 people, millionaires, move to Australia versus the next best, which was the United Arab Emirates at 4,500. Most leave China, India, Russia, and interestingly the UK. There's a bit of a bellwether here. The reason why the UK has seen quite a few people move is because of the high level of migrants, and particularly the social unrest that's there, and the rising costs of living in that country or in that area. of, I'll call it Europe, although they have left, except for Ireland, they have left. So that's a bellwether a bit for Australia. We need to make sure that if we're going to attract the millionaire class and their emphasis on bringing assets here, but also businesses and opportunities, we've got to do something about how we handle a range of things that I think are getting out of hand in Australia. Next slide, please. Quite political tonight, aren't we? If so, one of the reasons why prices go up in Australia is because the wealthy want to move here, and with that brings a higher price point because they pay with overseas mindset. And when you talk about Queensland, what happens in Queensland is people move from Sydney and somewhat Melbourne, but largely from Sydney, and they come to Sydney, to southeast Queensland, with a Sydney mindset. So when they see a price for, say, $1 million for a house, the locals say it's not worth more than 700. They go, geez, that's a bargain. I'm going to buy that. And that lifts the price points. And so that happens overseas, and then that transfers around the country, particularly to places like Sydney, southeast Queensland, Adelaide, and to some degree Perth, which attracts positive interstate migration as those people move out of Sydney and Melbourne, as those places get crowded, and that pushes the prices forward in those locations. The second reason is the high cost of building and the rising costs of building. Not only the high cost, but the rising. If you were to survey most developers, they will say that construction costs and a lack of labour availability are two of the major reasons why it's difficult to start a project, and that's one of the things that's stopping it. Next slide, please. Somebody I could see in the video screen is being fed food, and I'm quite hungry, so you might want to stop that. Let's move forward. The average cost to build a box in suburbia now is $550,000. It's nearly doubled in 10 years, and you can see how much it's escalated since the COVID period. So it's getting quite expensive to actually build just a standard house in suburbia. I think there's a real opportunity moving forward for more modular homes in Australia because of that. They're not necessarily cheaper on a rate per square metre, but they're very fast to build. They're not weather dependent, and they don't take skilled labour on site to do, and they can even take an AI component. So I think what we're going to see in Australia is a real eroding of the traditional builds that we've seen, because some of the modular stock that I'm working with a couple of providers, and also you can see from overseas, is really good. You can't really tell the difference between that and normal, what I call stick and brick construction. The second chart shows us what happens in the change in building costs. At the moment, they're rising still by about 6.7%. They got up to 18%, shock horror. If you take a decade average, they have increased by 6.1%. If you want to remove that COVID surge, they get to about 5% per annum. And if you want to take a 30-year, 40-year average, they increase by about 4% per annum, and they rarely decline. If they do decline, they go down by a little bit for a short period of time. So my answer to that is, and looking at moving forward, I think that building prices will go up 3 to 4% per annum over the next 5 to 10 year period. So it's not going to get cheaper to build stuff, and that is a reason why prices continue to go up. I know you can depreciate the building asset. That's great and everything else, and you should do that, particularly as an investor. Well, only as an investor. And the land value goes up, but still the cost to replace things keeps on going up. So that drags up the resale assets price as well. Next slide, please. The other reason, the third reason why, is we can't build enough stock. If you looked at the last 2 decades, you see that the need to build houses that are about 190,000 or thereabouts per annum. Of course, it's higher at the moment because of that population surge. But we could only build something like 170,000 per annum. Now, these are completions, the second chart, not approvals, because something like 40% of the apartment approvals never see the light of day. About 5 to 10% of detached dwellings never get approved. never get started because they're too hard. The developer sells the site. You have to put two storage, two drain drain pipes down when you budgeted for one, and people say, well, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to sell the site and so forth. And also when it comes to townhouses, something like 20% of the stock doesn't start. So I like to use completions, and that shows that we're actually undersupplied. Next chart, please. And if you wanted to do that on a moving basis, you could see that over the last 20 years, there's been periods where we've been undersupplied. Between 2006 and 2014, we struggled to keep up with housing supply, and as a result, prices and rents went up. We saw a period where not much happened, 2015 to 19, where we were at equilibrium, we were supplying the right amount of stock. We had an oversupply of stock, only for a short period of time, and that's to do with home builder and during COVID, and the population growth declined. And what we've seen now is a real snapback to an undersupply situation. If I went back to show this chart to 40, 50 years, which I can do with some gaps in the data, the undersupply degree is the worst it's been since the 1950s. And that's going to be very hard to actually snap back into a equilibrium situation. I don't think we're going to do that unless we have modular builds, and more importantly, we start to maximize our backyards. And do more backyard homes to cater for singles and couples living in the spaces that are underutilised in Australia. Other than that, we're going to be in a very undersupplied situation, not only for the next election cycle, but for the next decade. And that again places a real flaw in terms of building a new home and providing adequate supply in Australia. We're going to increasingly become a crowded house, not an empty one. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about interest rates before we wrap up, take a few questions, and I go and have some dinner and watch DCI Ray, the last one of the third season. Isn't it exciting? Next slide, please. Okay, it's all about jobs, and it's all about the unemployment rate. Anybody wants to talk about the interest rates and inflation and this, that, and the other, is you need to talk about jobs. And the amount of jobs being created as measured by the ABS, I could argue they don't do a good job there, but we don't have time, and we could talk about it maybe some future video podcast. If we just use the ABS measure, we could see that the job growth is declining in Australia. It's down by about 100,000 on last year. But more importantly, most of the jobs that are being created, 65% of them are in government-aligned industries. Many of them aren't productive. Many of them are jobs for mates. Many of them don't add to much. The private industry is really struggling, not only family-based, but medium to large-sized businesses as well. And as a result, I think, and it already is showing that the unemployment rate starting to edge up, that in the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to face an unemployment rate that's going to approach 5%. And that's going to start probably in the next couple of months, not going to 4.5 to 5% or 4.4 to 5%, but starting to edge upwards. And I do think, particularly with today's announcement, whilst it's only a monthly figure, shows that CPI is the lowest level it's been for about 7 or 8 years, for measured across a variety of trim means and all those type of fancy things that the ABS like to talk about, is that interest rates are inflation is starting to fall, and it's to do with the fact that people aren't working as much, some are being laid off, and the private business side of things is getting very tough. It's even tough in construction, or especially in construction in certain industries. So it's tough out there, and that means that interest rates are going to have to fall despite the jawboning of the Reserve Bank. Next slide, please. I'm not alone there. If you look at long money versus short money, and we're already seeing several of the banks, and one of the majors now, Commonwealth Bank, dropped their fixed term loans over the weekend. The financial markets think that the next fall will be down. And I concur and I agree. Next slide. Now, if I was to make a stab of it, will fall 5 to 6 times between now and middle of 2026. The first fall will be down November this year by 0.25%, and then I'll start to ease. We are stuck with mortgage rates somewhere between 5 to 6%. Okay, that's going to be the new normal. We're not going to get down to levels that we've seen during the even before COVID. I also think it'll be hard for any economy in the Western world to keep inflation between a 2 and 3, closer to a 2.5 to 3.5% range, and I think they're just going to have to live with that. But I do think that interest rates are going to drop, and pretty consistently over the next 12 to 18 months, back to again a cash rate of 2.85%, and mortgage rates somewhere for many borrowers somewhere between 5 and 6%. What would really be good is that if APRA took away the 3% buffer, which they applied during COVID, many other countries in the world put a buffer like that on it as well, but they've removed it. If APRA did that, we would actually see a large increase in the amount of people looking to borrow. And the biggest increase, the modelling I've done, would be that people who are looking to buy an investment property, and particularly a new investment property, and that would add to the rental stock available and would satisfy, the teals and the greens when it comes to an election next year, and also with the likely outcome of a very close election, and probably one with a Labor and green and teal governance. So one would think that sense will prevail and pressure will be placed on APRA and place that. Again, a lot of politics tonight. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let's wrap it up, shall we? Now, before I get into this, look, there's a range of white rhinos. The things that are happening that aren't that big of a shock, that are factored in here. Like we see interest rates rise, we don't see the world explode. We see a close election in the US, but it really doesn't matter broadly who wins, because of Australia and everything else, those type of things. And I've discounted some black swans, so we don't see war in the Middle East beyond the conflict that it is. We don't see Russia invade Poland. We don't see China invade Taiwan in the next 3 to 5 years. No, I don't think they'll do that long term anyway. So sense prevails. We don't see a depression. We might see bordering up to a recession in Australia, and that means that interest rates will drive faster than I thought predicted. So I factored those things in. So what we've got moving forward is we've got very healthy real estate fundamentals. Basically, demand exceeds supply. The property does run in cycles, and so you need to take a longer viewpoint. It's very hard to pick at the top, very hard to pick the top and the bottom of the market, and as they get shorter, I think you've got to play with a longer term viewpoint. We've got strong but easing population growth. That'll all sort itself out in the terms of the cutbacks and a lot of people saying it's too high and so forth. It was too low during COVID. Okay, so it'll sort itself out. We've got an undersupply of everything. Employment is the key to where interest rates go. I think the cash rate will start to fall by the end of this year. And if I get that wrong, it'll be early next year. Okay, it'll sometime soon. I think that for many markets, particularly those in the recovery and upturn stage of the cycle, you're likely to see 5 to 8% price growth for the next 12 months. And I think rental growth will be stronger. Now, more tenants on your title is the key to actually getting a better rental return. A lot of tenants can't pay that 8 to 15% increase, so they're going to have to share. And if your property facilitates that, either with appropriate design or with a duplex or with a back home, then you're going to do better than those properties that actually, only have 2 bathrooms that aren't ensuited and so on and so forth. So that's enough for me. Let's have a few questions and queries. Again, if you like the type of things I've said, not necessarily agree with them, and the way I've done it, Google my name and you can find out that you can get more stuff for me, some of it free, but I'd like a little bit of money. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay, we've got some questions. Somebody's asked me about the cost of building a single story home. Look, it depends on where you are and what slope and everything you're building on, but generally it's about it's around 2 to 2.5 grand per square meter to build that house on. And a modular provider in Perth, actually, there are a couple. I will send the guys an email with two such suppliers. One's based in Queensland, Urbex, who I do a lot of work with, but there is a supplier in Western Australia that's existing. So let's fire away though. I don't see any other questions in there. But you
I've
might
got a
have
couple, mate, and
fire
I'm
away.
sure people will put them in. But with your reports there, mate, do you have a link that you can put onto or give us so that people can check out that? Because I
Yeah.
mentioned, I
So
know you.
what I'll do is first thing tomorrow,
Yep.
I'll send you an email with some links, and a discount code. Let's say everybody can save 20%. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
So I'll
Yeah.
give you the coupon code, and you can share that. And if I don't get $20,000 by tomorrow afternoon, I'll be after you. I'm only
It
kidding.
sounds good. So, the Olympics there, I know it was on and off, and obviously we had the Olympics in Paris there a few weeks back, and it was pretty addictive viewing from my point of view. But are we a bit too far out to be talking about that and in lining that up with the property market, or you think it's just a bit of a red herring relevant to the property market and the 8-year time frame between now and then? What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, the property market will go through some cycles, in that
Mm.
period to then. Look, yeah, Paris was good. I mean, I used to play a fair bit of sport. And I still play golf, and I do a lot of fishing and kayaking and things like that. But did I watch any of it? Well, I watched Raygun. I thought it was fantastic. And I did watch some of the opening because we've been to Paris once or twice, and we noticed a few things. And I thought the opening was fantastic because many people are still talking about it. And
Mm.
so instead of being in a stadium, it was across the city, and I thought it was very well done. Look, let's just use Sydney as an example. Sydney earned $1.3 billion in revenue. So it was quite successful. It cost $6 billion to
Yeah.
host.
Yeah.
And Brisbane's
Jeez.
going to be worse than that.
Yeah.
And I could argue that the money spent on bridges, the money spent on schools, the money spent on crime prevention, the money spent on affordable housing, those type of things would be money better spent. The trouble is you don't cut a ribbon. You don't have
Mm.
a finite date. It's done in small pieces.
Mm.
There's nothing to clap and there's no. What do you mean you don't like the Olympics, Michael? You don't support the city, don't you? You're not Australian. There's something wrong with
Yeah.
you. Well, that's all fighting you. So we're going to see the Olympics. We're going to see the caveat of transformation of urban development, betterment for citizens. They're the type of things that now, in fact, they have happened in the last 5 or 6 Olympics. That's mandatory. And there's also some good things. I think 10,000 people competed across 200 from 200 countries, and there was 250 events. And the Paralympics that follow have less competition, but there's more events, and in fact, every event did have. I think there was equal number of male and females, and every event that's hosted has to have the female equivalent. So
Mm.
you could argue that if you went back to the modern Olympics, which was back in not the ancient Olympics, but the modern Olympics, which was back in the 19th, 18th century, that I think there was 250 odd. A bit of work before I babbled on about this. There was 250 white people running around an oval. You would guys, that is, you would argue that in that space of time, the Olympics has achieved some great things. I was amazed that nothing blew up. I really wasn't. I expected unrest in Paris, and I don't think I
Yeah.
was alone. The fact that it didn't says something. So
Mm.
they're good things, but from a property price accelerator, better use of money, of course, it's not
Mm.
going to do that. People aren't going to visit Australia after the Olympics. I mean, more people would come to Australia if we stopped telling everybody how bad the reef is, when in fact the Great Barrier Reef has improved dramatically in recent decade. You know, if we settle down the domestic, oh, it's not unrest, but lack of cohesion that is front page news. You pick up a paper in overseas at the moment. You used to read about shark attacks and Pauline Hanson. Now you read about what's happening with our opinions of the Middle East and so forth. It's not necessarily a good look. And so if we bedded that down, our tourism would increase. If we offered better value for money. There's some issues with, you know, I could go to Bali for X, or would I go to the Whitsundays? Well, the Whitsundays ain't cheap, and there's not as much to do there as there is in elsewhere. So, in short, no, the Olympics is a lot of noise. It'll be no doubt a lovely time for people who live in Brisbane to leave, and people to watch it on TV, and for some people to visit. Rock stars and the well-off will. But for most of us, it's, you know, it's just something there that, you know, I think we could do without. But anyway, again, sound like a sour grape, don't I?
No, it's all good. So moving on, and one of the questions from Steve Lowe from Melbourne, he's saying Victorian coastal properties seem to have dropped in the past 12 months as the COVID bubble caused a lot of people to panic buy in regional places. Do you see these areas turning around?
Yes, when they get to the price where the locals say, "Hey, that's value," and they start buying again. So a good example is mining town in Dysarts in the world, back in the mining boom. They were never worth $1 million. I know they might have been getting $2,000 a week in rent, but the locals would only pay back then 250, 260 for the prices. They're now down to 400. The locals are buying them, or 450 to 500. The locals are buying them. So what happens in those Victorian places are a little different, because if they're particularly in the Mornington Peninsula and so forth, they're trophy properties. But if they were actually, you know, in just average places, and look, at Malakuta and those type of places are lovely. But if they're like that in Broken Bay and so forth, then, you know, they're not worth that. And they're going to, again, comes back to the local prices. That's the only thing I could say that you know, without investigating. Again, it comes down to what the locals think. One of the questions is about rooming houses. Yes, there is a supply issue in terms of Brisbane, in terms of where they are and how they're done. I think one of the key things for rooming houses is the number of people you have living in them. I think anything over 5 is difficult. 4 to 5 is probably the mix. But to get something in particularly middle ring and suburbia that allows you to take in a tenant, separate entrance, even ensuite bathroom in a bedroom bathroom that's lockable is a way forward. It doesn't even need a separate entrance is, I think, a key thing.
Even having a car space, I think is important. A lot of people, they do have cars. Even there is public transport, they'd like to have that independence.
Yeah. Cars are
Yeah.
important. So,
Yeah.
you know, and the COVID's made that. I mean, the number of cars in Australia per head of population isn't in decline. In fact, Tasmania, it's nearly 1 for 1. So every 1,000 people, there's 1,000 new cars. The second place is Queensland. That's actually close to about 800. Victoria, it's about 650, 700. You could argue the public transport's maybe better, particularly in Melbourne and so forth. So most places, it's very large, and COVID's just shown that we you know, there are people going back to public transport, blah blah blah. But if people are going to look, I've showed again in one of my those master classes I've held, and you've attended those, and thank you.
That's
Is
right.
that, you know, most movements in the city are work movements particularly are a chicken scratch. They're all over the place. Like 70% of the movements are. People don't go to downtown, or they don't go crosstown, or they go to a regional centre. They're all over the place, and that involves cars. And we're not going to change that soon. We're not going to see any magic with driverless cars or any of those things. People are going to drive something. It might be electric, it might not be. Increasingly hybrid. and we're going to see people have cars. So they've got to store them somewhere. They don't have to store them in the biggest place in the house, which is the garage. They can store them in a driveway. Um,
Mm.
they're not that precious cars. I don't
Yeah.
think so.
That's it. So Joe's question is, how do I find the regional town in Queensland that has the highest projected population growth as well as the highest allocation of state and Commonwealth government spending? So,
Okay, so you go to ID, you go to search ID, pop. I'll send this link to the
yep.
guys, and then
Hmm.
you can go through a range of councils across Australia, and then you can search their population growth, and then you can search the size of their regional economy and what's fueling that local economy, and then you can pick it yourself. I could do it for you, but it costs you $5,000 to $10,000, and I think you can work it out yourself, Joe. So off you
Yeah.
go. Look, there's a lot of stuff available, and certain data sources are trustworthy, others aren't, and there's a range of providers. Just let me move this. I'm going to move your head sideways. I'm going to go to my work folder, and I'm going to see what it's called. Okay, now where did you go? You're back here. So if you go to, guys, if you go to profile.id.com.au, you'll find that there's a whole range of profiles by local government area. And there's a range of services they provide. They're free. Community profile and atlas, population forecast, economic profile, and so forth. Not all of them participate because this is a service that the local government actually employs this business to do. But many of them have an economic component, and you can see the size of the economy and so forth. But you can work that out yourself.
Yep. Sounds good. Thank you. Loretta's question is, could I have a modular builder address as well for Perth? Do you know anyone in Queensland who does second story modular installations? I know
Okay,
they are in Perth.
second story's hard. Um, most stick to a single story because of the way it's built and the way it's then assembled on site. I don't know of anybody who does a second story modular.
Yep.
Sorry about that.
Yep.
They
So,
might be, and somebody
yep.
listening to this might be able to help. But
Mm.
uh, and that I could have typed that in there. That's very good. I should have done that. Anyway, let's wrap it up soon because I'm getting hungry. Any more questions?
Okay. Sorry, mate. In terms
Yeah,
of
Summit Holmes is the guy, the people I was going to make a reference to. So okay, so that's on there. So okay.
yep. So in terms of the businesses you have, you provide services for modular homes as well. Is that you've got an affiliate business as well? Is that right, Michael?
Sorry, what? Repeat that
You
again.
have another side business, a side hustle that does modular homes as well. Is that right?
Oh,
Or
look, I used to have a thing called backyard homes, but because
yep.
of COVID and because we were building them stick construction, and the
Yes.
build was 59 before COVID, and decided our builder partners decided that, Michael, it's all too hard.
Mm.
And now the price points to do it old style is, it's $3 to $5 a meter. It
Mm.
becomes, it's not economic.
Yeah. Yep.
I basically said, look, we had a few get away and they were
Yep.
fights. So we said, no, but I am working with Urbex and their
Yes.
BMD
Yep.
in the modular space, and we're progressing that nicely. It'll be launched
Good.
early next year, but we've got examples of in
Good.
Fallman's that stock, and
Yep.
they're designed for. There's also two models. They're 60 or 90 square meters. They're 1 or 2 bedroom. They can go in your backyard. Look,
Yep.
they cost 100 grand as a kit. They cost
Mm.
150 to 180 grand to be assembled.
Mm.
That's for one bedder. The two bedders are closer to 225. You can't tell the difference. I mean, people are inquiring, just driving past the Thornland subdivision,
Mm.
going, God, where'd I get one of those from? That's cheap.
Yeah.
Look, a rate per square meter, they're not cheaper, but they take weeks to put up, and
Yeah.
they can be again done with unskilled labour, well, some skilled labour, and they can be done in a factory, and they can actually be done with a lot of AI.
Yeah. Awesome.
So, so what I do in terms of the listeners is that, I write something every week. They should get that if it's free. I sell a range of reports that are very focused in Southeast
Mm.
Queensland because that's where 50% of my market is. I do work in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, some work in New Zealand, Northern Territory on occasions, particularly if I can combine it with a barra fishing trip. I like to work there, and so forth. Although the last trip was pretty shit because it rained a lot, and we only Saratoga and tarpon and those, what are those threadline salmon things, ugly looking things with
Salmon. Yeah.
whiskers. Yeah, they
Yeah.
fight like hungry, but they're apparently good eating, but I don't, never
Yeah, they are.
but anyway, and I also do advice on projects. So, I do a project advice type documentation.
Yeah.
What I'll do is I'll send you a sample one of those, I think, so you could, if
Yeah.
anybody's interested, they can have a look. Look,
Yeah.
they range from 5 to 20 grand. It's
Yeah.
hard for me to do one less than 5, but it's bankable, and you'll
Yeah.
make decisions on your project. Often
Yeah.
you'll change your project because of what I've said, and all I'm doing it is, from evidence, and I've been doing it a while, like yourself. So you
Mm.
get to work on a range of things and say, "Geez, that's not going to work. That needs redesigning." And
Mm.
I don't understand who's going to buy that at that price point at the rate of sale you think, and so we need to either change that, or we need to drop the price, or we're going to have to, it's going to take 5 years to move, not 3 like
Mm.
you think.
Yeah.
And you're better off understanding that now.
Yeah. Very good. Excellent, guys. Well, thanks for being part of the webinar tonight, and thanks, Michael, for your time, mate. I won't hold you up for further.
I'm going to go, everybody. Love and leave you. I will send you an email tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Excellent, mate. Excellent.